Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, welcome to our side event, Human Rights in National Disability Policies, where we stand and how we should proceed. This event is organized or co-organized by the International Disability Alliance and McGill University Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program, and co-sponsored by Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and Indigenous Climate Action. All stakeholders that have participated and have joined us, the International Disability Alliance, for this event, thank you very much. Also, thanks to all of you who are in the room and those who will follow the event online through YouTube and other social media channels. We have captioning on the screen and sign language interpretation in the room. And we hope that, first of all, this side event not only covers interesting topic, but it is used as an example of how we can make events inclusive and accessible. The event today has a couple of objectives. We hope to first take stock of where we are in terms of a human rights perspective, specifically in the climate action agenda. We would also like to dive in how we can take this agenda forward, both national and internationally. And because we believe that our advocacy strategy should always focus on not only bringing evidence and data to the table, but also recommendations and possible actions moving forward, we hope that one of the main objectives of this session today would also be to come together and identify some solutions and actions moving forward. Let me first start by introducing our first speaker, Juan Ángel de Gubella, President of the Latin American Network of Persons with Disabilities and Their Families, RIADIS, and member of the board of the International Disability Alliance. Juan Ángel, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am standing here in a podium at the right of the panel, at the left side of José's, his left side, the right side of the persons who are in this room. I am here representing the International Disability Alliance. We represent 2 billion persons of disabilities, with disabilities in the world. And the International Disability Alliance have 8 regional members from all over the world. I must correct what I said. We represent 1.3 billion people with disabilities around the world. We defend the rights of the persons with disabilities in light of the CRPD. And today we are here at the COSP 28 doing the alliances with all of the delegacies of the state parties and the stakeholders in order to include persons with disabilities in the climate change action. So we are doing this advocacy to include persons with disabilities in the whole response and the whole actions made in the climate change framework. And also to include persons with disabilities in the sectors of health, work, education, and crisis, also refugees. This matters concerns the life of persons with disabilities. We face a lot of barriers in our daily life. It is important to be here at the COP28 in order to talk about the action at the local level, the national level, at the global level. It is very important to engage with the OPDs at the local level and then to take this action to the national level. And after that, to take approach of this situation, of these spaces, like the COP28, in order to take the lead in these policies for persons with disabilities around the world, and take those necessities of persons with disabilities that we have taken from the local level to the global level, and then to have the responses for people with disabilities in their daily lives at the local level. It's a go and back. It's a go and back strategy. At this moment, we have the 47% of national policies that does not include, that only include persons with disability, the 47%, which is a very poor for persons with disabilities, which means that we are not included in the very most national policies of climate change. So we are leaving behind. People with disabilities are facing the most barriers that we can say that 10 times more than persons without disabilities. So it is very important for the governments and the stakeholders to have data, disaggregated data, and in order to get to know where are the people with disabilities and what are the necessities of persons with disabilities. If we do have this disaggregated data by gender, by other intersectional data, we can now get to know how to do a better response to do this climate change action in order to attend people with disabilities. So, in light of the CRPD, we have these instruments for people with disabilities, but we must take action. It's necessary to take action and to look for the necessities of the people with disabilities, not only to have the policies. We are here to do the pledges and to look for the short term, the medium term, and the long term to include persons with disabilities in all of the action. I hope this week that we have in the COP28 gets a lot of work for us and to get a lot for people with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you very much for reminding us of the barriers that people with disabilities face in the climate action agenda and its intersectionality with other agendas such as humanitarian affairs, education, employment, and many other things. Also, thanks for highlighting the low level of national policies around climate action that include persons with disabilities. And also, thanks for highlighting the need of connecting all levels from local to global, but from global to local as well, in order to advance this agenda properly and in the most effective way for persons with disabilities. I would like now to invite Camila Polera, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing your last name, who will facilitate the panel. The panel will address some of the objectives that I presented in the introduction from different angles, always keeping in mind that the idea is to highlight where we are at in this agenda, but also where we would like to go. Camila, thank you for your moderation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose. It's such an honor to moderate this crucial discussion with such inspiring panelists. I would not take too much time of this discussion, so I would like to start focusing on already on the first objective of this event. And I would like to introduce our first panelist, Elhama Yousefian, Senior Advisor on Humanitarian Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Action at International Disability Alliance. My first question to you, Helham, is the following. Since 2022, International Disability Alliance and McGill University have been monitoring inclusion of persons with disabilities in NDCs and APAs. What is the most updated outcome of that research, and do you see any improvements?
Thank you so much, Camila, and hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for choosing among so many priorities to join this event. Well, as Camila mentioned, since 2022, the International Disability Alliance and the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program at McGill University have worked together to look at every single national climate policies and commitments and see what they are doing in terms of including people with disabilities. Actually, a couple of days ago, we launched the 2023 version of our report, which looks at nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans up to November 1st, 2023, so very up to date. And this is going to be available on UNFCCC press release section as well today. The report is available in English, French, and Spanish, easy to read version, and also a summary in sign language to be published soon. So let's see what we found. Unfortunately, Camila, I don't have a lot of great news to share. So we looked at all 195 parties to Paris Agreement. We looked at all nationally determined contributions. And as Jose and Juan Angel mentioned in the beginning, we found out that 80% of governments absolutely miss any reference to people with disabilities in their nationally determined contributions. Only 39 states out of this 195 does include some reference to people with disabilities. And unfortunately, again, most of these references are very vague, are just referencing to people with disabilities as vulnerable group that need to be protected without concretely clarifying what needs to be done to include people with disabilities. Only 15 governments have some concrete actions included in their nationally determined contributions about what exactly they want to do to include people with disabilities. Only 6 states in this world make reference to rights, human rights of people with disabilities in their nationally determined contributions. It is important to recognize that people with disabilities have the knowledge and expertise to play a role in climate action. But only in 4 of these nationally determined contributions, we see acknowledgement and recognition of knowledge of people with disabilities. And when we come to participation, this is the last bad piece of news, only in 2 of these nationally determined contributions, there is evidence that actually people with disabilities have been consulted and have been part of the development of the nationally determined contribution. We also have looked at national adaptation plans, what we call NAPS, National Adaptation Plans, which actually is where governments need to clarify what they want to do in order to adapt to climate change, because we cannot stop climate change. So part of the strategy should be adapting. And well, for adaptation, we have a little bit of good news, because last year in 2022, we found that 46 states mention people with disabilities in their national adaptation plans. In 2023, this number has increased to 65. So in a year, 19 new governments have put disability in their national adaptation plan, which is a good progress, but still 67% of countries worldwide still miss any reference to disability in their national adaptation plans. And again, this issue of vague and very general references continues in national adaptation plans. So out of these 65 mentions, only 26 do list some concrete measures that they want to take to ensure that people with disabilities are actually included in national adaptation plans. All right, what do all these numbers mean? What we like when we look at this 80% missing in national determined contributions and 67% missing in national adaptation plans, what is concluded is that we are facing a systematic exclusion of people with disabilities from national climate policies and commitments. So this is an urgent issue, this is a reality, and without inclusive policies, inclusive action is not going to be possible. My colleague is going to talk about that later, but we all know that inclusive policy is necessary, but not sufficient for inclusive action. So, I mean, we do have some good examples. We have some good nationally determined contributions, some good examples of national adaptation plans that could be used, but still many governments, and in particular many developed countries who are actually more responsible than other governments for climate change, are among those who have very little or zero reference to people with disabilities in their climate policies. The good practices are mostly from the Pacific or Africa. For example, if I want to mention some, I'm not going to mention those who are still missing, but in terms of those who have done good job, for example, Vanuatu still has one of the best nationally determined contributions in terms of disability inclusion. There is a specific heading in their nationally determined contribution on disability. They allocate some funding. They prioritize climate plans by people with disabilities, and they list concrete actions in detail about what is going to be done to include people with disabilities. So that's the finding of our research. It is available for reference. We have kind of scored countries in terms of referring to people with disabilities. We have provided 0 to 7 scores for inclusion of people with disabilities in nationally determined contributions, and 0 to 6 scores for inclusion of people with disabilities in national adaptation plan. So the best case scenario, one country can score 13, but of course no one is scoring 13 in our assessment. And there are many who unfortunately score 0. So today we are here to talk about and also learn from other groups, including colleagues coming from indigenous groups and women's group, colleagues coming from action, from research and advocacy on the ground, to see what we can do to address this systematic exclusion. So thank you so much for that opportunity, Camila, and I will be back with further comments later in the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elam, and thank you for this comprehensive and I would say problematic analysis of this systematic exclusion, as you call it, of people with disabilities in references across national determined contributions and the national adaptation plans of the parties of the Paris Agreement. This systematic exclusion is a reality that must be changed, and on this note, I would like to introduce you, JC Chiblo. education and training manager at the Indigenous Climate Action. And JC, to you, please tell us a bit about the analysis you have done to assess inclusion of Indigenous people rights and sovereignty in national climate policies. Was your research findings more positive than disability inclusion analysis?
Thank you. I first have to introduce myself in my Indigenous language as it's part of our protocols. So Anin, Bojo, Minande, Beneshinkwe, Indijnakas, Gitaganzi, Bean, Donjaba, Gigo and Dodem, Anishinaabe, Kwe, and Dao, Port Moody, Megwa, and Dinda. So hello, my name is JC Chiblo. As mentioned, I work with Indigenous Climate Action, and I am Anishinaabe from so-called Canada. I first want to give a shout out to the research team at McGill University for offering and supporting this research. I think it's vital, and without them, this resource would not be available. The finding of the analysis on Indigenous rights were also quite disappointing, but they're also in line with what Indigenous Climate Action has been saying for years. Indigenous folks have also been structurally excluded from a lot of the nationally determined contributions and climate policies in general. So now on to the question. I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of what the report concluded on and a little bit of a background of the analysis that was done. So this report explores the Indigenous rights obligations of states in the context of climate change and analysis to the extent of which Indigenous peoples and their rights are included in in climate state policies and nationally determined climate contributions. To determine whether states are abiding by their obligations under international law, we examined states' climate commitments under the Paris Agreement and their domestic climate adaptation policies across 5 different metrics. I will only be highlighting the first 4 since they seem the most relevant to me. So the first one that we took a look at was the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in the creation of these things. We also took a look at the recognition and protection of Indigenous knowledge systems, and also the recognition and realization of the rights of Indigenous peoples. The recognition and restoration of Indigenous jurisdiction over land as well was analyzed and had some of the most disappointing results. The report explores key Indigenous rights and provisions under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It outlines implications for domestic climate policy making that should be upheld under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, mentioning that such states should ensure that climate mitigation and adaptation policies and programs do not undermine the rights to health, food, and water of Indigenous peoples. Although most states include at least one mention of Indigenous peoples in their climate policies, the quality of these references varies significantly. Most states fail to meet their obligations as outlined by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other sources of international law. Our analysis revealed that Indigenous peoples participated in the design of only a minority of climate policies. Just 32% of the nationally determined contributions and 19% of climate adaptation policies analyzed indicated that Indigenous peoples participated in their formulation. Quite low numbers, in my opinion. 60% of states did not include reference to Indigenous rights in their nationally determined contributions. And in climate adaptation policies, 79% did not include reference to Indigenous rights. I personally feel that those numbers are way too high, and it is just really disheartening to hear that there are other groups that are experiencing this same type of exclusion. This is incredibly frustrating as an Indigenous person experiencing the COP space, as some of the negotiations on things like Article 6 have resulted in the removals of key language that respects human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples. And options have been added that are concerning and may result in degradation or violations of commitments to the Paris Agreement that can allow continued emissions at source. Largely, we need to see Article 6 include strong language for emissions avoidance and uphold Indigenous rights and the rights to free, prior, and informed consent. One of the biggest concerns for international Indigenous peoples movements has come across the negotiation this year is the conflation of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and states going so far to reduce Indigenous knowledge systems to local knowledge. This is a concern for Indigenous peoples because we have fought for generations and decades for recognition of our unique and inherent rights as defined by the UN and Rights on Indigenous People. You may hear me mention that a few times. This is an international mechanism that can further advance local or state level treaties that our communities have signed, having an international legal mechanism and framework on which states should be upholding. In other words, this declaration provides a legal rights framework for us to work with and puts Indigenous peoples into a unique rights holder's position. I would just like to finish with a quote from my boss, Ariel Cheku-Duranje, because I feel like it encapsulates the reason why Indigenous rights should be included in international climate policies. Our identities as Indigenous peoples are inextricably tied to the lands, waters, and ecosystems that we come from. As the climate crisis continues to worsen, our communities are experiencing increasingly dramatic changes that disrupt our lifeways and our ways of life. Despite the fact that we are responsible for it, we are recognized as stewards of 80% of global biodiversity, yet we remain relegated on the sidelines of the Conference of the Parties here at the UNFCCC negotiations and in setting policy and climate action. Our delegation is here to join the global Indigenous movement to challenge false solutions that allow ongoing extractive capitalism and colonial narratives that continue to invisibilize us and erode our rights. These also do little to functionally address the climate crisis or reduce global emissions. There is no climate justice without human rights. There is no climate justice without disability justice, and there is no climate justice without the full recognition of Indigenous rights. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you. There is no climate justice without human rights, and in this justice, all human rights of all groups must be protected, recognized, and implemented. So thank you for calling out this failure. Now I would like to give the floor to Alba Saray Perez Teran, from Climate Change Policy Advisor of Oxfam Belgium. And my question to you, Alba, Oxfam Belgium has conducted some research and advocacy on inclusion of women's rights in Belgium energy and climate policies, and also in Peru. We would like to hear some details about that, what you found, and how did your advocacy work?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me as well. I think it's very important to speak about intersectionality, and every time we speak of any of the human rights that are being violated. What I want to share today is a story of success that I hope it can inspire also other advocacy processes, and share how we managed to change things in the legal scape in Belgium. The problem, to start with, 5 years ago, is that in Belgium the climate and energy policies had no references to gender and to women's rights, and the plans on gender equality, they had no references to climate policies. And we also have a very complex governance system in Belgium. However, one of the solutions that Belgium had used to respond to the climate crisis was the use of biofuels. I mean, this was a European law directive that was implemented also at the national level. And I mean, I think all of you know this is a false solution. We have been calling out for that for many, many years. And in the specific case of Belgium, we found that in 5 years, Belgium had taken out biofuels from 75 different countries. That means that whatever was not being addressed in the national context was having impacts on the rights of people, of women, of indigenous communities in 75 different countries. the situation today is that we have a national climate and energy plan, which is a bit to the European Union what the nationally determined contributions are to the UNFCCC. That has gone from having 0 mention to gender, 0 mentions to women's rights, to on the first draft having 2 mentions to gender. And the last version that was submitted, I think 3 weeks ago, has 27 mentions to gender and 21 to women, and it also includes disabilities when referring to people. In the first draft, they were speaking about disabilities of enterprises to access the market, which I think is also very concerning. And within that plan, there is the new renewable energy law that is phasing down biofuels, and that has explicit mention to the impacts of this biofuel policy on women's rights, on child labor, on workers' rights, on land grabbing, a series of different elements that we suggested to analyze. Because the perspective from the government at the beginning was that there was no conflict, there was nothing to report in this report. So now it is there, and it is by law that they have to analyze it, and it's part of the decision why they are phasing down biofuels, not only because of the environmental impacts, but also because of the social impacts, to summarize. How did we manage to do this? We conducted several researches. We are actually now doing even a third one specifically on gender. But so we did 2 reports, collaborating with our colleagues from Peru and from Brazil, in plantations that we thought at the beginning were providing biofuels to Belgium, and we discovered that they were indeed buying from them. It was very difficult to find that connection because the global trade markets make sure that there is no trace of those value chains, and they try to hinder the information, but we managed to have the information connecting from both sides. And so what we found was that there had been plantations that were started thanks to the funding from European countries, from US also, and some other global donors. Also that the companies that were extracting the biofuels from these places were many times linked to fossil fuel companies that were based in the global north. And that there were clear cases of land grabbing of different communities. There had also been many protests and around the plantations, and there were several cases taken up to justice as well, at least in the countries of extraction. In terms of women's rights, what we saw is that there was an impact on sexual and reproductive health and rights. There were problems of harassment, of gender-based violence sometimes due to the increase of alcoholism around the agribusiness. There was an increase in care work for different reasons, because when the partners were working in the plantation, those who were staying at home, many times the women had to take up other tasks as well, waking up before or going to bed earlier, working more hours. There were also diseases linked to the plantations, to the contamination of water and air, and also discrimination in jobs, and the list is still very going on. But, and we insisted very much on this, we did not want to do this study with a perspective of women as being vulnerable and poor, and this stereotypical image that is many times appearing in policies. And so we were also in touch with women that were doing demonstrations against the plantations and try to also raise their voices. And to be able to take this all the way to the political level, a couple of things maybe to share. Working in coalition, in different coalition is very important. We were collaborating with different councils, official councils attached to the Minister of International Cooperation, of Environment. Also, the Climate Coalition in Belgium, that is a coalition of now 100 members going from NGOs, trade unions, feminist organizations, and so on. And so we try to connect to the policy level all the times that we could, sometimes in more official consultations, sometimes through the media, sometimes doing demonstrations. And we also use the UNFCCC spaces because the good thing, and I'm going to wrap up very soon because I see it's 7 minutes already. The good thing about these spaces is that we have a lot of people together, so we were able also to have some partners talk directly to the ministers in these spaces. And also suggest that ministers from the different sectors talk to each other, including also from gender equality, which is not usually the case. And having international text was very useful also to have an impact and to remind the mandates that they have at the national level and at the regional level. Yeah, to make sure that there was something concrete to be done. There are many more things to say, but I don't want to take all the space. But I'm happy to answer to questions later.
Thank you, Alba. Thank you for sharing a story of change and emphasize that this is not just possible, but also achievable. Now I would like to give the floor to Emina Chirimovic, Senior Researcher at Disability Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Emina, you have conducted some unique research on impact of climate change on people with disabilities. Through your research, what do you learn about inclusive climate policies and how they can lead to inclusive action?
Thank you so much, Camilla, and thank you everyone for being here. So since 2021, Human Rights Watch has documented the disproportionate effect of climate change on people with disabilities and older people. And we have documented deaths and really severe health and both mental and physical health impacts. We have worked with disability rights activists and experts, with scientists, with climate change activists to understand what needs to change. Today, I wanted to focus particularly on Bangladesh, especially since Bangladeshis live at the front lines of climate change. Bangladesh contributes only 0.56 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, yet Bangladesh is among the countries that are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Therefore, the government of Bangladesh has developed extensive disaster mitigation response systems, which has actually significantly lowered the risk of mortality in Bangladesh over the last few decades. We usually have to advocate for something as simple as reference, as we have heard from other panelists. But what our research found in Bangladesh is that the government actually has put in effort to include people with disabilities in climate disaster mitigation and response policies, mainly thanks to the advocacy by people with disabilities themselves. In 2018, Bangladesh hosted the Dhaka Declaration, which included strong commitment on disability inclusive disaster risk response and climate change adaptation. The most recent national adaptation plan in Bangladesh recognizes that people with disabilities are at a higher risk, that they face disproportionate risks. The plan even highlights that certain people with disabilities are more at risk of climate change-induced disasters, including people with mental health conditions or psychosocial support. The plan goes further to actually commit to prioritize disability and age-inclusive response and adaptation, and commits to empower people with disabilities to participate in locally led measures. So we would say that as far as the research that I have done, I have seen that Bangladesh has the most inclusive national adaptation plan, and commitments have been made. However, last year when we investigated the situation of older people and people with disabilities during the flooding in Bangladesh, we found that unfortunately, none of these measures, none of these policies have led to action on the ground. Lack of action, despite inclusive policies, led to deaths and unnecessary suffering of people with disabilities. Several people included in our report have died, including children. For example, Shamsu Nahar, she was a 12-year-old girl who had cerebral palsy. She spent a few days in waist-deep water, and she developed fever. There was no way for her mother, Fatima, to take Shamsun to an ambulance to provide her with medical care, and several days later, Shamsun died. The family was not even able to properly bury Shamsun, and her mother said, we dug a hole in soil that filled it with water, and we just buried her. What we have documented, in addition to the deaths, is really severe impact on people's physical and mental health, and we wanted to understand what else from the policies was not delivered. So one of the reasons is that authorities did fail to deliver early warnings and adequate assistance with evacuation, shelter, healthcare, etc. And when we spoke to people with disabilities, they all said that if they had received early warnings, the situation would have been different for them. Either they would have left their homes and went to a relative who lives on a higher ground, they would stock up on a medicine that they missed. One person in particular, he told us that he believes that his mother, who was 80 and didn't have access to medication during the flooding and who died, he said that he believed if he had received early warning, he would have stocked up on the medication that his mother needed and that she would probably live. In addition to lack of early warnings, so as I mentioned earlier, the policies are truly inclusive to make sure that everything is accessible to people with disabilities. Yet, all people with disabilities that we interviewed who managed to reach the shelters found that these shelters were not accessible. They were not accessible in terms of having accessible toilets for people with physical disabilities. One man with a physical disability who is in his 50s, and he told us how he had actually to crawl on the floor to access toilets. And again, that literally goes against even some of the commitments that we have heard here from the Bangladeshi government in terms of making sure that their disaster risk response and climate change adaptation plan is accessible, inclusive of people with disabilities. So what we else did is that we spoke to, as I mentioned earlier, really this report wouldn't have been possible without the understanding that we received from, information that we received from local disability rights experts. And so one of them said that this is in general the case. We have strong policies, but there is a lack of implementation. So for example, I mentioned earlier how the government did commit not only, what we are seeing in the documents now at COP, and I would love to hear reflection from Elham and maybe others, is just a reference to people with disabilities without any true meaning. So for example, what we have seen in Bangladesh is the government did commit to make sure that people with disabilities at local levels are included in disaster management, which is something that we advocate for, and the government has committed to it. However, the disability rights activists confirmed to us that this only happens where there are strong organizations of people with disabilities, which is rare. And so that mostly actually this is not happening, and again, it's not translating into the practice. I wanted also to show a video of people with disabilities who have lived experiences, including from Bangladesh, but since I did do also research on Canada, we have also included voices from Canada, and we are currently also implementing a program in a research project in India. So I would like to show a video on what needs to happen according to people with disabilities themselves.
People with disabilities are the most vulnerable communities affected by the climate change. Let me give you a few examples.
Displacement is one of the biggest challenges for people with disabilities.
I live in Delhi NCR in India, where smoke levels are so high, people using assistive devices for respiration. All of them, it's impossible for them to live.
Summers can be very hard. Months of headaches and migraines, a lack of temperature regulation within the body. Many persons with disabilities, such as those with multiple sclerosis, living with mental health conditions that need antidepressants, those with chronic fatigue and autoimmune conditions, all experience this at higher frequencies.
Year after year, persons in the Caribbean experience a sense of climate anxiety around the anticipation of some major catastrophic storm, disaster, and it's time we understand how that anxiety affects our mental health.
We want our rights. We believe people with disabilities can live and perform like others to make disability inclusive climate change movement. We need a disability inclusive policies, laws, and activities to ensure equal access for all.
I'm calling for more research, more data, a better understanding of exactly how we can look at climate change and mental health and create better solutions.
The only viable solution in the world we live in is autonomy, true autonomy. When governments pay attention and meaningfully include those most at risk of climate change harms, and it includes us, people with disabilities, it will in turn enhance protection and safety for everyone.
Include persons across disabilities. Have them at the table. If we don't bring persons with disabilities at the table and think of an inclusive climate change response, we're again looking at not just a future, but a today where we're leaving persons with disabilities out and behind.
Thank you, Mina, for shedding light on the severe impact experienced by people with disabilities in a critical environment like Bangladesh, which is already, as you mentioned, at the forefront of the battle against climate change. And thanks for the video, as these experiences are not limited to Bangladesh, but people with disabilities of all the world that are impacted, and to highlight the problematic gap between policies and concrete actions. I would like now to encourage from the floor interventions and questions to our panelists. We should have a microphone. Thank you. Any questions? Then I think I can ask you a question to you all. Based on what you have done in your respective areas, and one has been discussed here so far, what do you think would be the next steps to address the systematic exclusion of human rights from national climate policies and commitments? I would like to give the floor first to Elham.
Can start? Yeah.
Yes.
Sure. I mean, it was very interesting to listen to colleagues working on indigenous rights, on women's rights, also listening to what Emina has experienced on the ground and has documented on the ground. So as of next steps, I think one thing interesting for me was what Alba mentioned about not only advocating for making climate laws and policies inclusive of women, but also making gender and women policies inclusive and like referencing to climate change. I think that's something that would be helpful for all of us. For example, for us at Disability Movement, I think it would be great for us when next time many of us as people with disabilities are working on national disability laws and policies, and we look at them and try to advocate for better and more human rights-based laws. So I think something that would be very helpful is that we take this dual approach and try to make sure that also disability movement is aware of and disability policies are inclusive of climate change concerns. Another thing that struck to me on this conversation was how there is a strong connection between inclusion in policies and strong advocacy, and how strong advocacy requires strong capacity. So I think something that would make sure that this gap between inclusive policies and inclusive action is addressed is that making sure that organizations, for example, women's organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, disability organizations, youth organizations are equipped with advocacy skills, with the knowledge and expertise and capacity that they need to advocate for implementation of inclusive laws. So, and also request for inclusive laws. I think something important is to emphasize as much as possible on intersectionality. That was actually the idea behind this event today. I mean, we have always been partnering with McGill University for the last 3 COPs since COP26, and it has always been so important for us to emphasize on intersectionality and how, when I'm advocating for disability inclusive policies, I'll also advocate for gender inclusive policies, for indigenous inclusive policies, for children inclusive policies, and also for the intersectionality considering multi-layered identity of individuals. So I think these type of conversations would help. Hopefully, I'm going to go to Alba when I'm advocating for any disability inclusive policies to check with her what would be the best way to advocate for gender inclusion at the same time and ensure that women with disabilities are properly included. And I hope that, for example, Jace comes to me and say how we can make sure that our advocacy for indigenous inclusive policies would be inclusive of indigenous people with disabilities. I think that intersectionality would be our next step. And eventually, I think guidance would help. I know that there is a guidance existing that has been developed by OHCHR, and I am happy to announce that the United Nations Partnership on Rights of Persons with Disabilities has started funding a program being implemented by UNDP, International Labour Organization, OHCHR as UN partners, and the International Disability Alliance as the non-UN partner, to work on making sure that we have a guidance on how to make sure that nationally determined contributions are inclusive of people with disabilities, considering intersectionality concerns. So I think this type of guidance would be very helpful to break this cycle of exclusion in policy and exclusion in action. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elham. And now you, Daisy.
So I first wanted to just kind of give a little bit of history when it comes to the rights of Indigenous peoples being recognized in the UN space. Although different, the inclusion of human rights and the rights of Indigenous people are linked and are vital for future generations. Human rights are individual rights and freedoms and were recognized in 1948. We are actually celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Declaration. Indigenous peoples have known for generations that our connection to the land and to our Mother Earth is not only unique, but vital for a just and equitable society, and was only recognized in 2007 by states when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted. So what do we need as next steps? I agree with my panelists. It needs to go beyond lip service, as it was clearly outlined in this case of Bangladesh. My home country is no better. In the country that I live in the same year that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was implemented in one of our provinces, the Wet'suwet'en people were forcibly removed from their lands and territories that they were protecting for future generations at gunpoint. We need political will that sees human rights and Indigenous rights as essential to climate stabilization and releasing the climate crisis from one that is an economic crisis. We need financial resources to support the involvement of all people on this panel here, as well as Indigenous peoples, in the development of climate policies. Our other research that's being released actually tomorrow highlights how my home country of Canada has structurally excluded Indigenous peoples in the development of their climate policies. So if you would like to read a little bit more, that will be released on our publication page on indigenousclimateaction.com/publications. I just want to end by saying meaningfully engaging with Indigenous peoples, women, youth, and people with disabilities in the development of climate policies can ensure that not only all of our rights are upheld, but human rights are upheld as well. So I really strongly agree with my panelists here that without all of these extra pieces, there will be no climate justice. And we do need to ensure that these folks have a space to not only share their experiences that we can all learn from, but be able to offer insights on how countries can do better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, Alba, please.
Thank you. There is something that I think has been said by several of us, and is this idea that there are countries that have issues with human rights, and then there are countries that don't have issues with human rights, and then we need to go and help the other countries. And this is something that I think we see for Indigenous rights and for women's rights, and I think it's part of this mentality of international cooperation as aid. Instead of saying we live in a world that is inherently patriarchal, that is extractivist, that is neoliberal in many policies, that is colonialistic, and that is touching upon every one of us, everywhere. And with this, what I want to say is that countries in the global north need to look at their own issues, to say it politely. And we need to correct the blindness that we have, or the lack of consideration of different issues in our national policies as well, because I do believe this is a win-win situation. When you change the mentality in the country that is extracting resources from other countries, you will immediately also have a positive impact on the other side. And one of the ways that is fundamental to do this, and it has also been highlighted several times in this conference, is the importance of having data, disaggregated data, and the panelists have also mentioned that, and in an intersectional way. And it's very, very, very complicated. I've had a colleague working on data for 8 months in Belgium, and it has been such a hassle to find information to connect to this. And then even when data is there, it is not known, it is not used in policies, so it has to be accompanied by training. And once you have all of that, you need to put finance into it to actually go to policies. And one of the instruments to have this finance is to use gender-responsive budgeting to at least know what is being supported and what is not being supported. So these are just some of the ideas for next steps, but there is a lot of work to be done.
Thank you, Alba. Emina, please.
Thank you. There may be 3 points I want to make, and I will try to be short. But before I do that, are there any questions at this point? Because we have been...
I think there is one question on the floor.
There as well. Okay.
There.
So maybe we take questions, because people opened up, and then I can maybe address some of the questions with my answers.
Can we have the microphone, please? Thank you.
So the question is, hello, my name is Fatima. I am a disability inclusion and accessibility from the UAE. It is clear to me listening to today that we need to demand from parties to practice what they preach. If and demand to be seen, my question to you is, how can we leverage technology to unite and share the narrative? Share stories of Shamsin and others. We owe it to them so their lives are not lost in vain.
Thank you, Fatima. Collecting other questions before answering? Yes.
Hi, my question is for Amina. I'm also Amina, but I was wondering if you could speak more about in Bangladesh. You mentioned that they are stating it in their policies and frameworks, but the implementation is lacking. Can you speak a little bit more about why you think that is? And I know you said that on the advocacy side, when it's there, you've seen some success, but is it just like, is it resources? Is it just that, you know, it's talk, but not actually, they don't want to put money where it is? Like, just kind of how that's, where the gap is between it being said and then the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mina.
Yeah, hi, Lad Cannell with Bank Information Center in Washington, D.C. We're an independent NGO. We also advocate for inclusion. And my question is, what would you want to say to the multilateral development banks about their programs and policies and actions in terms of inclusion? Thanks.
Thank you. I think we have one last question over there.
Thank you very much for the panelists and the presentation. My question goes specifically to Elham. I'm Ambrose Mrangira. From the data and looking at NDC and NAP, National Adaptation Plan, realize there's a very big gap. I'm so much interested in that area. And from my experience out of engagement with government bodies, the problem always comes out as lack of knowledge. There's a knowledge gap between the how of inclusion. That's where the problem is. So that's why you say that NDC and NAP are very silent on disability inclusion because they don't know. Now, the question goes back to you. How can we, and especially us in the room, solve that issue to the government's agencies to ensure that they're able to understand the how of inclusion, to ensure that in the future, the NDC and NAP are disability inclusive? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the questions. Now, turning to the panelists. Elham, where do you want to start? Okay, Emina.
Fatima, thank you so much for your really important question. So I didn't mention this earlier, even though I did want to mention it, but yesterday, actually, I got the news that someone that I interviewed in Gaza, who is 39 years old, who was 39 years old, has a visual disability, and he was killed yesterday. And yesterday, I was literally not able to sleep, and I just had the testimony of what he has told me over the course of several weeks that we have spoken play in my head over and over again. And one thing that he told me, in addition to, consciousness of humanity must wake up because we people with disabilities cannot survive this, and what's happening in conflict is also relevant to climate change disasters. But one thing that he told me that goes to your question, Fatima, is that he said, so every time when we interview someone at Human Rights Watch, we ask them if they want to be introduced and identified in our reports by their real name. And he said, yes, I want my story and I want my name in your report. I want my story to be used so that someone stops this discriminatory thing that's happening to us. Every single person with disability that I've spoken with is so eager to change their situation and what's happening. And we often, the community often considers people with disabilities as something that, Elham mentioned earlier, in this vulnerable group, without recognizing that they also, something that was mentioned earlier when it comes to Indigenous people, have the knowledge and skills on how to adapt to climate change. And we really owe it to people who have lost their lives to use their stories to advocate for better inclusion and better protection. To go back, Amina, to your question about Bangladesh, I did pull it up and I did want to mention it, but since I ran out of time, I didn't. But Bangladesh is experiencing enormous financial loss because of the climate change that Bangladesh is not responsible for. When I mentioned the National Adaptation Plan that is very committed to inclusion, Bangladesh estimates that it will cost $230 billion dollars to carry it out. And at the same time, Bangladesh has also identified difficulties in accessing international financial support. The other day, actually, I went to the Bangladesh pavilion. It was the first time for me to speak with the government since they haven't really been responsive to my efforts to speak with them. And I had a really good conversation with one government official when he said, yes, that's true, we need help, but we also can't wash our hands of people with disabilities just because we don't have the funds. There are things that we can do. But definitely to recognize that funding is one of the issues. I've spoken for quite a bit. I'm also happy to take other questions, but would rather leave it now to other panelists.
Thank you, Mina. Elham?
Yeah, I want to answer a question about what we can do to change this lack of awareness. I think first thing is that we need to first enhance our own knowledge, right? How much we know about what is the NDC, what is the NAP, what exactly they are, what exactly they are not. So first thing is that as advocates, as disability rights advocates, or human rights advocates and climate change advocates, we need to enhance our knowledge and information and expertise about this topic. So we are going to these type of meetings in a strong, knowledgeable way. The second thing is that we have to strengthen our connections with climate action advocates at our national level. So this is not something that we can do just by ourselves or single-handed. This is a group movement. I really believe that if different groups join forces at national level, if we as disability people reach out to women group, indigenous groups, youth group, and all of us join forces to advocate for human rights inclusive NDC or NAP, that would be a more successful way. That's exactly why we wanted this panel today. So my second recommendation or suggestion is that we strengthen our connection. We inform them, we sensitize them about disability inclusion, and all of us advocate under one single umbrella for human rights inclusive NDC or NAPS. Number three is that for building the knowledge and expertise, there are also some international mechanisms. I'm aware that UNFCCC is, for example, providing some technical support to governments upon their request for developing their NDCs. And I think this is a very important channel that I have been looking into if I have the capacity to work with the UNFCCC technical advisory teams to make sure that the advice that they're providing to countries is inclusive of disability inclusion. They advise countries that make sure to include people with disabilities, make sure to include women, make sure to include indigenous peoples in your NDCS or NAPS. So I think at the international level advocacy, we can also approach the UNFCCC, and there are also other NGOs, there are other civil society organizations at national, regional, global level who provide this type of support. We have colleagues from the Center for International Environmental Law here, which is a huge environmental NGO here. They are connected with many civil society and so on. Other panelists here, we have Human Rights Watch, we have Oxfam. So I think all of these organizations are somehow in touch with different governments, with different civil society, and that's how we can inject the knowledge of inclusive national commitments and policies to make sure that the outcome is what we want, a more inclusive NDCS. And last but not least, documenting these type of assessments that we are making, documenting what is missing. Like, you go check your respective countries on my report, the report that we did on disability analysis, the report that Jay's team did on indigenous analysis. Find the status of your country and start to raise that in your media, in your national social media, in your mainstream media. Share with your people. And what we call the policy of naming and shaming, name your country and mention that, look, hello, you are missing this inclusion in your NDCS, in your NAPS. That's what we really need to do, like publicizing this information, and distributing as much as possible. These are like the comments that I can provide for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alba.
Thank you. I would like to take the question on the multilateral development banks. And I'll start by reading one sentence that we had in our report from 2021 that says, multilateral financial institutions such as the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Development Bank of Latin America started to provide financing for projects targeting the emerging European biofuel market. It was also during this period that Belgium and the Netherlands decided to invest in maple ethanol, which is the plantation that we studied, in northern Peru through their the development banks, BO and FMO. By 2013, financial loans funding biofuel production in Latin America reached a total of $1 billion. So I think what we researched at the beginning of this, and this is why we started going to that case studies, because there was funding from these banks to that study. We didn't know when we went there whether Belgium and other countries were still buying from this plantation. We knew that there had been an investment. We didn't know if the plantation was still there. We learned that we are still buying from this plantation, that the plantation was still there, that land grabbing was still ongoing, that protests were still ongoing. So when banks do financing, first of all, they need to ask, who is this investment benefiting? I mean, I think it's very clear for them, you know, who this is benefiting, but from a human perspective, who is actually this really benefiting? I mean, here, this was clearly to expand a market from the global north. Second, double the safeguards or even triple them, and do listen to civil society that are doing research on this. At the time that these investments were happening, there were already many reports from civil society organizations on the ground saying there is an issue of land grabbing, there is an issue of water grabbing here, and this is going to have many problems. And those reports, they were not taken into account. There were other alternative reports done to compensate for that, that were not necessarily very scientific done at the same time. So do listen to civil society. It doesn't need to be always IPCC, FAO, and important bigger institutions. Civil society is very close to the reality, so it needs to be taken into account. And the last thing, it's very important to consider that even when we stop the investment because we realize it was not a good investment, there is a long-term impact happening. In this case, this investment happened 15 years ago. BIO decided to stop investing in that, but the plantation didn't go back to the farmers or to the communities. It was sold from an international group to a Southern American group, and up to today, it's still being used. So investment is not there, but the land is not there either, and the pollution keeps on going. So it's not something that can be corrected by removing one decision. So we need to, triple the safeguards.
Thank you, Alba. Daisy, yes.
Alba, you definitely hit the points that I was going to make. I took a little Google, and on the U.S. Department of the Treasury website, it claims America's leadership in these institutions ensure that the United States can help shape the global development agenda, levering its investments to ensure effectiveness and on-the-ground impact. I mean, it sounds good, but I have a question for them, is what exactly are they investing in? So-called Canada has invested in a pipeline that has violated Indigenous and human rights for so many years and has spent billions of dollars pushing that through without the consent of Indigenous peoples. So when I see these banks coming forward and they say that they're leveraging investments, I just want to ensure that we are pushing that these investments are not further violating Indigenous or human rights, because that is an ongoing issue probably across the world, but definitely for sure in Canada where I'm from. So that would be my response to that question, and just building on your excellent points already.
Thank you so much. And I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to all our esteemed panelists for their invaluable contributions. Today we have collectively delved into the heart of some critical issues, and their recommendations and the best practices presented for enhancing the role of human rights and the right-based approaches in climate policy at both national and global level have been nothing short of inspiring. These discussions have laid a foundation for more inclusive, effective, and human rights climate action. And I would like to leave the floor to Jose for the final remarks.
Thank you, Camila. Thank you to all panelists. Thank you, Camila, for your great moderation and also for the work that the Center for International Environmental Law is doing in support of human rights. It's hard to provide closing remarks after such great presentations, but I would like to share a couple of things. And I believe that when we all come to these type of conferences, we come with a bag full of asks and expectations. But I also know that when we go away from these conferences, we take a lot of things from them, right? So let me just share with you some of my takeaways from this great panel and some of the conversations that happen in this room. The first thing is multi-partnership. We have heard from all panelists and even from the floor the need for this multi-partnership approach. We cannot do this in a segmented and individualized approach. Not only because we have a lot of common agendas across different constituencies and across different stakeholders, but because the only way to push this agenda forward is if we all come with what we can contribute with to this agenda, but also trying to think how we can implement solutions. So for me, the first key word is multi-partnership approach in advancing the human rights agenda and the climate action agenda. The next thing that I would say is the climate action agenda is, if it's not the most, is one of the most important agenda that combines different agendas. It's impossible to address human rights within the climate action agenda if we don't include agendas like employment, job or access to green jobs, education, health, right to land. So I think the fact that we are more aware of the need of looking at the climate action agenda from the most holistic approach, it's for me the other thing that all panelists have loudly said and shared with concrete examples. Next is maybe for me the most important element, and that is that in order to advance the the disability inclusive climate action agenda, we need to build upon what I always like to call evidence-based advocacy. The disability community, and I'm sure other constituencies, we come from a history where somehow we always started by advocating based on what we believe was happening. But after hearing all panelists today, the amount of information that we are collecting, the number of stories and testimonies that we are documenting, the increasing need for data disaggregated by disability, by indigenous people and other elements, is critically important if we really want to advance that evidence-based advocacy approach. Next is this concept that all of our panelists shared, which is we need to move from political will to financial compromises. Otherwise, our agenda will only be full of nice words and fantastic wishes, but very little of concrete actions and result-oriented approach. Next, and I promise that my list won't be too long, is the need for developing the skills of those, like organization of persons with disabilities, that are in the driving seat of this agenda. We as persons with disabilities are more aware or more engaged in agendas related to social affairs, health, employment, and it is fine. We come from that space. Those were the topics that we first identified as crucial to advance our disability inclusion agenda. But the climate action agenda has helped us to realize further that we need to move on to new spaces. And those new spaces require, as I said at the beginning, multi-partnership approach if we really want to be effective. Last but not least, all our panelists have referred to not only the policy level discussion that needs to happen, not only the global big frameworks that we need to influence, but also how the climate action agenda impacts truly the life of people with disabilities and other constituencies. So if it's not the climate action agenda, what can be the agenda that kind of bring us all together in realizing that the change that we are promoting at conferences like COP will definitely impact on persons with disabilities and other constituencies. For me, what I would say is that when we walk out from this room, not only we have learned from our panelists different pieces of information and different experiences and different research, but we now carry out with us the big responsibility of making the change happen. And the only way that I believe this change will happen is that if we identify what is our role in this journey of disability inclusive climate action. That's why when I see in the room people that are working more on the financial global architecture, others that from UN agencies are committed to produce knowledge and to produce guidelines for disability inclusive climate action, when I see OPDs that are asking more and more about NDCs and NAPs, how to be more inclusive, clearly I see that we are already identifying our responsibilities and our contribution to this agenda. I truly believe that what we have learned today is something that we have to take it forward. We have to work at the national and the global level. But the most important thing is that let's all commit to advancing the climate action agenda from a human rights perspective. I think we are more and more losing that perspective that it also applies to the Sustainable Development Agenda, the Inclusive Trade Agenda, and many others. This lack of understanding that the only way to advance on those agendas is if we do it from a human rights perspective. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the organizations that have participated. IDA is honored to partner with McGill University, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, Indigenous Climate Action, Center for International Environmental Law, and everyone in this room, because the only way to do what we want to do is that if we have more spaces like this to discuss and to address COP to be more disability inclusive. Thank you very much, and if I'm not mistaken, we can close the session unless there is a final comment from the floor. No? So it was a long day. I'm sure that many of us are already tired after more or less 10 days of COP. We wish you all a fantastic rest of COP, and there is only one ask that we have as panelists, as people on the stage. What we have heard today, let's put it out there in different events and hopefully in some of the official sessions. That is the ask that we have for all of you. Thank you so much and have a good night.